Okay, we'll start with the lecture now. Yeah, good evening everyone. I'm Dr. Nihar Thakkar. I've done my post-graduation from Government Dental College, Mumbai. We have already covered the major topics regarding conservative dentistry which are usually asked in the various entrance examinations. Today we will be covering some other topics which are commonly asked in various competitive exams. Okay, to start with, the first thing which we will be doing is first topic. If you have any doubts, please feel free to ask at the end of any topic. We are starting with the first slide. We are starting with rubber dam. Now, rubber dam, which is included under isolation, there are quite a few questions which have been commonly asked in the recent years in various competitive exams. So, those points which are very important from solving the MCQs have been covered. Okay, so starting with rubber dam, rubber dam basically contains more of facts and figures. So, please note it down. Okay, so starting with the first slide. Okay, so first of all, what we need to know is what are the dimensions of the rubber dam sheet. So starting with rubber dam material, that is the rubber dam sheet. The dimensions are 5 by 5 inch, which is 12.5 by 12.5 centimeters. Please note this down. These are very straightforward MCQs can be asked from these particular facts. It can be 6 by 6 inch or 15 by 15 centimeters. Now, these rubber dams are actually available in various thicknesses, or they are also called as weights. Now, these are the various weights or thicknesses of rubber dams, which is the thin, which is 0.006 inch or 0.15 millimeters, medium, that is 0.008 inches or 0.20 millimeters. These values are very important for solving the MCQs. Various questions have been asked from this particular topic, from this particular slide. Heavy, that is 0.010 inches or 0.25 millimeters. Extra heavy is 0.012 inch or 0.3 millimeters. And special heavy, that is 0.014 inch or 0.35 millimeters. Okay, so going to the next slide. Now we'll just go through revise what are the components of the rubber dam clamp. Now, as you can see in the figure over here, the black and white figure, the rubber dam clamp basically has rubber dam clamp is also called as rubber dam retainer. Please remember this. The rubber dam clamp has basically the following parts. It has basically a prong, jaw, and a bow. Okay, now there are 4 prongs. Now these prongs should contact the tooth, as you can see in the figure, at the line angles, respective line angles of the tooth. They should not extend beyond the line angles of the tooth, because if that happens, it will impinge on the interdental papilla and traumatize the interdental gingiva. So they should not extend beyond the line angles of the tooth. So there are 4 prongs in a rubber dam. You need to know all these things because they are very straightforward questions can be asked from these topics. Secondly, there are 2 jaws. You can see the labeling in the diagram as well, and a bow which connects the 2 jaws. Now, where is the retainer applied? The retainer is applied to the posterior most tooth, which acts as the anchor tooth. Whereas in the cases of carrying out endodontic treatment, only the tooth to be treated is isolated. So the clamp is applied to the tooth, which is to be isolated. Now, retainer, the other function of retainer is that they are also used to retract the gingival tissue. One more thing, what you need to know about retainers is that while isolating the anterior teeth, there is no requirement of a metal retainer. Where in place of retainer, the other substances that can be used to retain the rubber dam sheet are what we call as a rubber wedgets, or a rubber dam folded rubber dam sheet itself, or a dental floss can be used in case of anterior. However, anterior clamps are also used in anterior teeth. Next, the 2 figures, blue color figures, which you can see at the bottom of the screen are, one is the winged retainer and second is the wingless retainer. Now the wing retainer, you can see the 2 wings which are denoted by the yellow arrows. The larger one is called as the lateral wing and the smaller one is called as the anterior wing. Okay. The one on the right side, the figure on the right side is a wingless retainer. Now one more question asked regarding this topic, regarding the retainer, is that what are the functions or what are the advantages and the disadvantages of the wings of a rubber dam retainer. Before we go to the advantages and the disadvantages, I would tell you what are the functions of the wings. Now wings are actually, they provide extra retraction of the rubber dam sheet, which has been included under the heading of advantages as well. But they provide extra retraction of the rubber dam from the operating field before conveying the retainer with dam to the anchor tooth. Okay, now what I just said that we will be discussing in the later topics, that what are the methods of application of rubber dam to the tooth. So the method in which the clamp and the retainer are attached together to the tooth, in that particular step or in that particular technique, the wings help in retraction of the rubber dam. Other advantage is that they allow the attachment of the dam to the retainer. Now the question has been asked recently regarding the disadvantages of the wings. So you need to remember what are the disadvantages of the wings. Now wings basically interfere during the restoration of a class 2 cavity. This is how you can remember, because they interfere with the placement of matrix bands, band retainers and wedges. So the question has been asked regarding the disadvantages of wings in one of the AIPG papers. Teeth to be isolated while we are performing any operative procedure on a certain tooth. Okay. Now starting with the first, please go to the table. Now while working on incisors and mesial surfaces of canines, the isolation is done from first premolar of one quadrant to the first premolar of the opposite quadrant. Okay, for example, if you are working on the right central incisor, or in that case even on the left central or lateral incisor, we need to isolate the teeth from the premolar of the left side to the premolar of the right side, both in maxillary as well as mandibular arches. Now the second area is the distal surface of canines. Now while working on distal surface of canines, the area to be isolated is from the first molar, the first molar distal to that particular canine to the opposite lateral incisor. For example, if we are working on a distal surface of maxillary right canine, the maxillary right first molar, isolation should be done from maxillary right first molar to the maxillary left lateral incisor. So this table is also very, very important. While working on premolars, which teeth are to be isolated is that two teeth distal to the premolar on which we are performing the procedure, and anteriorly to include the opposite lateral incisor. If you note properly that while working on distal surface of canine or on the premolars, the anterior extent or the tooth which is isolated in the opposite arch is the lateral incisor. And while working on molars, the teeth to be isolated are the tooth as far distally as possible and anteriorly to the opposite lateral incisor, that is lateral incisor of the opposing arch or a contralateral arch. Now as we said before, metal retainers are not usually required for when isolating anterior teeth. Okay, in some cases they are required, and however in anterior teeth, if a metal retainer is to be placed, it is placed in cases of performing or restoring any class 5 cavities, because while restoring class 5 cavities which are in close proximity to gingiva, we need the retraction of the marginal gingiva. So this is one more point which you need to remember when it comes to isolation. Now going to the next slide. The question which has been asked in AIPG 2006 paper. Please read the question. For a root canal therapy of maxillary canine with distal caries, the isolation done is the second premolar to lateral incisor, first molar to opposite lateral incisor, adjacent two teeth on both sides, only the tooth to be treated. Okay, in this case, please read the question properly, because notice that the holes These are very straightforward questions that would be asked. While punching the hole from axial central incisors, the distance of the hole from the end of the sheet should be 1 inch or 25 millimeters. Whereas while there is some variations in this particular value, while working on a patient with a large upper lip, that is if the lip length is more, the position of the hole should be more than 1 inch from the edge, whereas in case of a pediatric patient or a child or a patient with a small upper lip, the holes are positioned less than 1 inch from the edge of the rubber dam sheet. This was the first point is one of the questions which was recently asked in one of the papers. That is the distance between two adjacent holes. Okay, it is 6.3 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch. 6.3 millimeters or 1/4 inch. Now, these are few points which we need to know. And what will happen if the distance between the two holes that are punched, if it is excessive. So please note that if the distance is excessive, while placing on the tooth, there will be wrinkling and folding of the rubber dam sheet. Whereas if the distance is inadequate, that is, two holes, if they are punched very close to each other, while placing the sheet onto the tooth, okay, while passing the holes to the respective teeth, there will be stretching of the rubber dam sheet, and because of which there will be result in space formation between the dam sheet and the tooth. These are also asked in one or other form in various competitive exams. That is, what will happen if the distance between the two holes is excessive, or what if the distance between the two holes is less than what is recommended. This is one more question related to above fact. I hope I'm audible. This is one more question which has been asked in Am I audible? Please reply. Okay, so we have corrected the audio problem. Okay, now continuing with the question. You must have read the question properly. Now, as we discussed, we'll analyze each and every option. Now, if the holes are placed, the option A that states that the holes are placed too far apart. Now, as we discussed in the previous slide, if this is the case, then it will be wrinkling of the rubber dam sheet. So, this won't be a reason for the protruding of the interdental papilla beneath the rubber dam or the sheet, and they are to be seen. Next is gingival enlargement due to inflammation. Now, the purpose of rubber dam is to provide isolation. So, even if there is gingival enlargement, okay, the rubber dam sheet provides isolation, and then if the rubber dam application is proper, the gingiva or any other areas are not exposed apart from the tooth, which need to be isolated. And last is rubber dam. The third option is holes are placed too close. Now, as we have seen in the previous slide, that if the holes are placed too close, there will be a stretching of the rubber dam sheet. Okay, and there will be this will result in a space between the rubber dam sheet and the tooth. Okay, so the answer is C. I hope you understood this. This is not a straightforward question, but the information which was given in the previous slide can be applied over here to find out the answer. That because this is a question from the AIMS 2011 paper. In the rubber dam. Now, proceeding forward with the techniques for the rubber dam placement. Now, another question has been asked on this topic as well. This is also an important topic which we will be discussing the techniques in short now. Now, basically there are three techniques for rubber dam placement. First technique is the rubber dam placement prior to placement of rubber dam. That is, the clamp is placed onto the anchor tooth, and then the rubber dam sheet is passed over the clamp. Next is the clamp and the rubber dam, they are placed together, and third is clamp placed after the placement of the rubber dam. Now we will be seeing this with diagrams or photographs in the next slide. We will be discussing each in short. Okay, now proceeding with the first technique, that is the clamp placement prior to the placement of the rubber dam sheet. Okay, as you can see on your screen, that there are two figures. The one on the left shows that the placement of the retainer has been done, and on the right it shows that the hole of the punched rubber dam is then passed through the bow and over the wings so that it is adapted to the tooth properly. So this is one of the techniques. So the clamp is placed first, and then the rubber dam sheet is then stretched over the clamp. Okay. Now the advantage of this particular technique is that it provides maximum visibility while placing the retainer, because we can see the gingival tissues, so we can place them properly without impinging onto the gingival tissues. This is the advantage of this particular technique. Now proceeding to the next technique, one question has been asked regarding this particular technique in specific. Now, what is this technique we'll discuss in short. First, the rubber dam retainer is placed on the tooth, okay, to confirm if the fit. But the fit of the retainer under the tooth should be proper. It should not be loose or it should not be moving. Once the fit is confirmed, what we do is that, as you can see in the figure over here, then the rubber dam clamp is holding the rubber dam forceps are holding the rubber dam clamp. Okay, now without removing, the retainer is removed from the tooth, without removing the forceps from the holes of the rubber dam clamp. As you can see in the figure over here, the sheet is then stretched onto the bow. Now the question asked regarding this particular topic is that what is the location or what is the position of the rubber dam forceps when the clamp and the rubber dam are placed together. So the answer to this is that the rubber dam forceps lies below the sheet. The rubber dam forceps, or the parts which are below the sheet, are represented by a dotted lines in this particular diagram. Okay, so this is the question that can be asked. Now, what is the advantage of this particular technique? Now, any technique can be used depending on the operator's comfort or operator's preference, depending on case to case. But what we need to know, what are the advantages and disadvantages of each particular technique. Now, the disadvantage of this technique is that reduces the risk of retainer being swallowed or aspirated before the dam is placed. Okay. Now, one more thing, there is a possibility in the previous slide which you saw that the retainer is placed first. So sometimes there is a possibility that it might get swallowed because of accident, of course. So to avoid that, this technique can be used. Since we are talking about the aspiration of the rubber dam clamp, one more thing we need to know is to avoid this accident. We have a dental floss about 12 inches, that is 30 centimeters, is tied to the rubber dam clamp. So even if it gets aspirated, so that the clamp can be pulled out. That is the reason why the rubber dam floss is tied to the rubber dam clamp. Now this technique has one disadvantage, that because while the clamp is placed, we cannot see the surrounding tissues or the gingiva. There is a possibility that the clamp may be placed in such a manner that we may impinge upon the underlying gingiva. So this is the disadvantage of the clamp. As the advantage is that it reduces the risk of retainer being swallowed. Also, it solves the occasional difficulty of trying to pass how are the contacts, are tight or very tight, and it is the testing and lubricating of the proximal contacts prior to the placement of the rubber dam. This is the first step involved in the application of rubber dam. This is followed by punching of the holes, lubricating the dam, selection of the retainer, testing the stability of the retainer, and then the required procedure, whichever procedure the clinician chooses to use. Now, the first step by removing the dam is that when multiple teeth are isolated, the first step is cutting the septa between the two teeth, the septa of the rubber dam. That is the area which is between the two teeth. The first step is cutting the septa. This is followed by removing the retainer, and this is followed by removal of the rubber dam sheet from the tooth. Now, if a single tooth is isolated, right, like in cases of performing endodontic treatment, the first step is eliminated, that is cutting the septa, because only one tooth is isolated and no septa of rubber dam between the teeth. So in those cases, this is the removal of the retainer. Directly retainer is removed. That is the first step. Only in the cases where the single tooth is isolated. Otherwise, please remember that the first step in removal of rubber dam is cutting the septa between the rubber dam. Now these are the points regarding rubber dam which you need to know for answering the questions for various competitive exams. Is a very simple topic, but these are the facts which have been presented before you, which will help you in solving the MCQs related to this topic, this particular topic. Now, moving forward, we'll be talking about the cavity preparation for cast restorations. We have already discussed about, in brief, about the cavity preparation for amalgam and composite restoration. Now, one more thing about is the cavity preparation for cast restoration. Now, the cavity preparation for cast restorations is very detailed, very minute factors need to be considered by performing this cavity preparation for cast restoration. But before the questions asked regarding this topic, we'll first overview what is the basic design of a cast restoration, or cavity preparation for the cast restoration. Before we proceed with the cast restoration, what are different kinds of cast restoration? Okay, they can be either intracoronal or extracoronal, or partially intracoronal and extracoronal. What we'll be discussing over here is that inlay, which is completely intracoronal inlay. Now, this inlay can have surface extensions wherein it can cap one or two cusps. If all the cusps are capped, it is not called an inlay, it is called a onlay. Okay. So this is basically inlay and onlay. Even the full metal crown is also cast metal restoration. Here we will be discussing mainly about the cavity preparation for inlay, which is completely intracoronal without any surface extensions. That is without any cusp capping. So before we proceed, we need to know what are the various indications of inlay restoration. Now, inlay restorations are mainly used when there are extensive proximal caries, that is, the proximal lesion is very extensive, extending from one line angle of the tooth to the other line angle. In such cases, it is not possible to use amalgam. Okay, so in those cases, inlay restoration is preferred. Secondly, when the proximal margins that is the gingival seat of the restoration extends to subgingivally. This particular restoration is the restoration of choice. Going to the next point, in some cases when there is a need to establish ideal contact, contours and embrasure form, this is the restoration of choice, because cast restorations are indirect restorations. That is, the restoration is fabricated in a laboratory, because of which there is a better control over the contact and contours of the restoration, and hence when there is, even so in cases of extensive carious lesions or extensive destruction of the teeth, it is possible to recreate the contacts and contours satisfactorily. Reproducing contacts and contours would be very difficult in case of direct restoration, intracoronal restoration. Now going to the slide. Now, what are the properties of cast restoration that dictate the outline form for the cavity preparation? Okay, now we need to know what are the basic properties because of which the cavity form is prepared in this particular manner. We will be discussing about the properties which you need to know about cast restoration. Now, cast restorations have very high compressive strength. Secondly, they have high tensile strength, unlike ceramic and amalgam which have low tensile strength. Cast restorations have high tensile strength, because of which the cavity preparation for cast restoration can be beveled, because they have sufficient strength even in thin sections. And third, the get control over contacts and contours, which we just said, that since it is an indirect restoration. We will just overview the cavity design for preparing a cast restoration inlay. Now this can be discussed under three headings. Okay, this is just an overview of the cavity design before we go ahead. This is the preparation part, a apico-occlusal taper, and the preparation of the circumferential tie component. Now, starting with the preparation part, now we need to know that there should be a single insertion part, and this insertion part of the restoration should be opposite to the direction of occlusal loading, and this part is usually parallel to long axis of the tooth crown. Now, what is the purpose of creating one preparation part? Okay, or the single part of insertion and placement, insertion and removal. The reason being that this would decrease the micro movement of the restoration during the function of the restoration in the oral cavity, and thereby it will contribute to the retention form. So basically, having a single preparation part contributes to retention form of the tooth, of the restoration. Now next is apico-occlusal taper. Now, since we are discussing, these points are common for both intracoronal as well as for extracoronal restoration. The figure on the left side of the screen, that is for intracoronal restoration, shows that there is a slight taper that is given to each of the walls while preparing the cavity for the cast restoration. In case of intracoronal restoration, a slight divergence is placed to the cavity wall, while in case of extracoronal restoration, a slight convergence is provided. Okay, now what is the ideally for maximum retention, the opposing walls of the tooth preparation should be perfectly parallel to each other. But as you know that cast restorations are usually prepared in the laboratory, that is, the impression is made, the cast is formed, thereby a pattern is made into the cavity or upon the tooth which is prepared, and then the final restoration is fabricated. Now during these procedures, during the removal and insertion of the wax pattern, as well as during the time of the restoration, that is removal and insertion, there should not be any interference. Okay, so to avoid this, that is for the convenience, a slight divergence is placed in the intracoronal restorations and slight convergence in the extracoronal preparation. So please remember that this taper, or the apico-occlusal taper, is basically one reason is for the convenience form. Now going to the next point, that is the preparation feature for circumferential tie. What is circumferential tie? In simple terms, we can describe circumferential tie as the peripheral marginal anatomy of the preparation. Okay, that is the anatomy that is created, the design which is given for the cavo-surface margin of the restoration. We are basically discussing about the class 2 inlay over here. So for intracoronal preparation, The circumferential tie components are bevels and flares. Now bevels, the circumferential tie components on occlusal and gingival walls are called bevels, whereas the same circumferential tie components, the design of which will be discussed in the forthcoming slides, the circumferential tie component on the proximal walls, as on the facial and lingual proximal walls, are called as flares. Whereas in case of extracoronal preparation, the circumferential tie component is the finish line, which you must be knowing. Bevel, as you can see on the figure to its right, and it involves only a part of enamel. Okay, it does not exceed 2/3 of its dimension. That is, does not exceed 2/3 dimension of the enamel thickness. And this is usually not used in cast restoration. Okay, this bevel is not used in cast restoration. The function of partial bevel is to trim the unsupported enamel rods if they are present in some of the area. Okay, so the main purpose of partial bevel is to trim the unsupported enamel rod from the marginal periphery. So it basically contributes to the resistance form. The next is a short bevel. As you can see in the figure to its right, that short bevel includes the entire enamel thickness, but it does not involve dentin. Now this bevel is used commonly in cast restoration. Proceeding to the next slide, long bevel and full bevel. Now long bevel, as you can see in the figure, it includes whole of the enamel, and apart from this, it includes up to 1/2 of the dentinal wall. Now, what is the advantage of long bevel or the short bevel is that they preserve the retention and resistance features of the preparation. Whereas the full bevel, as you can see over here, it includes all the dentinal wall and all the enamel wall. The entire dentinal and enamel wall is involved. So because of which the internal retention form as well as the resistance form of the restoration is compromised to a great extent. So full bevels are indicated only in those cases in some clinical situations whereas it is where it is any other bevel cannot be given. Okay, so usually full bevel is avoided except in the cases where it's impossible to use any other form of bevel. So these are the advantages and disadvantages of each form of bevel. Now another form of bevel is that counter bevel. Okay, now when is this bevel given? It is given when the capping of cusp is required, that is to protect and support them. The capping of cusp or the main function of capping of cusp is resistance form. Okay, now there is another term called as cuspal coverage apart from cuspal capping. Now cuspal coverage contributes to the retention form. Primary function is retention form, whereas cusp capping is for the resistance form of the restoration. Now why is cusp capping done? So as to protect or support the weakened cusp. Now, as you can see in the figure, this has a gingival inclination facially and lingually. Now there is another form of bevel, that is the hollow ground bevel. Okay, now what are the last three bevels? That is the bevels which extend into the dentine. That is a long, full or counter bevel. They can be prepared in this particular form. That is a concave form. Now what is the advantage of preparing the bevel in this concave form is that they allow for more metal bulk and they have better resistance to stresses. Okay, so this is the advantage of having a hollow ground bevel. So please remember each and every bevel, that is partial, which is used only for removing unsupported enamel. It involves only a part of enamel is involved. Short bevel wherein the entire enamel thickness is involved. Long bevel wherein, and thirdly, bevels reduce the marginal gap between the tooth and the casting teeth or more folds. Now by reducing the marginal gap or by bringing the cast alloy closer to a tooth structure, okay, the cement line is reduced. Also, it helps in retention form because more surface area, the contact area is increased because of placement of bevels. So it also contributes to retention form. Please note that in case of composite restoration, the primary function of bevel was to increase the surface area for increased retention and also for aesthetic purposes well so as to merge the restoration with the tooth structure. Whereas in case of cast restoration, the primary function of bevel is to eliminate the cement line, which will allow for the burnishing of the metal to the tooth structure. Here also it contributes to retention form. Now talking about some specific bevels, there are some bevels, especially the hollow ground bevel or the counter bevel which we just discussed, they contribute to retention form. And bevels are said to be flexible extensions, allowing inclusion of the surface defect or supplementary grooves. Now you must have seen on many tooth structures on the occlusal surface that apart from the primary grooves there are many supplementary grooves. Now for a cast restoration, these supplementary grooves should be included into the preparation. Okay, so for that purpose, for inclusion of those grooves into the preparation, the entire cavity need not be extended. Only the bevel can be placed so as to include those supplementary grooves into the cavity preparation. Thereby these bevels, they contribute to the conservation of tooth structure as well, wherein this defect, surface defects or minor grooves are to be included into the cavity preparation. Now another form of bevel which we just discussed, gingival bevel also has the same function as that of occlusal bevel. Apart from this, the weak enamel is removed, thereby increasing the strength of the marginal enamel. Now as you all know, the weak enamel, the cavo-surface margin of the gingival teeth needs to be removed in the cavity preparation for the amalgam restorations as well. In those cases that is called as the gingival bevel or amalgam restorations, the angulation is 15 to 20 degrees. Whereas in this case, the angulation of the gingival bevel for cast restorations is 20 to 30 degrees. As we just said that it produces a 30 degree marginal metal in case of gingival areas when the gingival bevel is loose. One more thing which you need to know about gingival bevel is that gingival bevel should be pointed to the dentinal wall proper. Now what are the functions of primary flare? Now the functions of primary flare are exactly same as that for those functions that are performed by bevel. However, it has an additional and important function that since it is placed in the proximal areas, they bring the proximal facial and lingual margins of the cavity preparation to cleansable and finishable areas. As you can see in this slide, the previous slide, that the tooth where the red arrow has been placed, it is cleared from the adjacent tooth. Okay, that clearance from the adjacent tooth can be attained in this cavity preparation for cast restoration using a primary flare. Okay, so they are indicated for any facial or lingual proximal wall of an inlet. Now in some cases the placement of primary flare won't suffice as objectives. Like for example, in some cases it won't be possible to bring the margins of the preparation into cleansable areas. That is, it is not possible to have a clearance from the adjacent tooth. Okay, so in those cases a secondary flare needs to be placed. Now secondary flare, what is a secondary flare? It is actually a flat plane superimposed peripherally to the primary flare. Now unlike primary flare, secondary flare is present only in the enamel. Okay, in some cases it may involve dentine, but it is usually primarily placed in the enamel, and unlike secondary flare, they do not have constant angulation. The angulation can vary depending from case to case, and they have different angulation involvement and extent. It is not constant like in case of primary flare. Now what are the indications of secondary flare? Now please see the diagram which is given on the right side of the screen. Now if you can see on the above diagram, toward the extreme right, you can see that the wall is extremely acute. Okay, the cavo-surface angle is extremely acute. Now when can this occur? In cases of extremely broad buccolingual lesions, lesions which are wide buccolingually, in those cases a primary flare, if a flare is used, to have a clearance from the adjacent tooth, it may result in an acute angled tooth structure, and as we know that acute angle tooth structure is susceptible to fracture, and primary flare needs to be at an angle of 45 degrees to the primary wall proper, dentinal wall proper. So this function which cannot be performed by primary flare, in those cases a secondary flare is superimposed upon the primary flare. Now looking at the diagram below, we can see the red dotted circle. At the center of the circle, you can see a dotted line. That is actually a secondary flare. Now this is second diagram, the diagram which is shown at the bottom. It is for the case, for the indication of the secondary flare, wherein the contacts, there are very broad contacts or Malpose contact areas. Cavity width should be 1/4 the intercuspal distance. Okay, so under the heading of greater surface extension, we can say that we need to remember that the walls are divergent, which we just said that divergence should be 2 to 5 degree taper per wall. Secondly, the bevels are placed, and thirdly, the width. All these factors contribute to greater surface extension. Okay, the width, the bevels, and divergent walls in case of cast restoration. Now going to the second point, that is greater depth. Now, in general, for a cavity preparation for amalgam, the cavity depth should be optimally 1.5 millimeters. Whereas in case of cast restoration, it is said to be 2 millimeters. Now, why is it deeper? In case of cast restoration, in spite of the fact that it has better physical properties, that is better compressive strength and tensile strength compared to amalgam. The reason being that, as we just said, the cast restorations are indirect restoration. The cavity is prepared, impression is made, cast is poured, and then the wax pattern is made. Now, for the wax pattern to have sufficient bulk during its fabrication, during insertion and removal, the cavity depth is kept at minimum, at least it should be 2 millimeters, basically for the manipulation of the wax pattern. Please remember this, that the depth for the cast restoration is more compared to that for a cavity preparation for amalgam, in spite of the fact that it has better physical properties. It is basically for the manipulation of the wax pattern. And third point over here on the screen, you can see that it has divergent walls, which we have discussed previously. Amalgam, the cavity preparation for amalgam has convergent walls. We need to place undercuts for retention of amalgam. Whereas in case of cavity preparation for cast restoration, there should not be any undercut. Rather, the walls are divergent. So what is the purpose of placing divergent walls? It is to facilitate the removal of the wax pattern during the fabrication process, and for the removal and placement, or that is during the trying procedure of the cast restoration and during the placement of the cast restoration. Some amount of divergence needs to be given. Last is the beveled cabo surface angle. As we discussed before, the angle now to start with, what is tarnish? The difference between tarnish and corrosion will be discussed first. What is tarnish? Tarnish, in simple words, it is just surface discoloration on a metal. Okay, and tarnish is said to be the precursor of corrosion. So tarnish is basically surface discoloration of metal or a slight loss or alteration of the surface finish or luster. Now, what are the causes for this discoloration or loss of surface finish or luster? The causes are the formation of hard or soft deposits on the surface of restoration. Now, as you all know, hard deposit, the most common hard deposit is calculus. Various soft deposits are plaque or other films which are formed by the microorganisms. Next is stain and discoloration, which can be caused by either by various pigment producing bacteria or by various medications which are consumed by the patient, or it is tarnish can be also because of thin films which are formed on the surface of the restoration. Now these films can be either oxides, chlorides and sulfides. Now one MCQ asked regarding this topic is that they usually give 4 options. What are the corrosion products or the factors responsible for tarnish? And 4 options are given. So you need to know amongst the 4, the 3 are oxides, chlorides and sulfides, and the 4th is the incorrect option. So usually they ask which of the following is not responsible for corrosion or for not responsible for tarnish. So please remember the 3 compounds which are responsible for tarnish are oxides, chlorides and sulfide. These are same for corrosion as well. And when these thin films are formed, they are an early indication of corrosion. So tarnish is said to be a precursor of corrosion. So going on to the next topic which is important, that is corrosion. Now, unlike tarnish, corrosion is not merely a surface deposit. Now, corrosion is actually a deterioration of a metal caused by reaction of the metal with its environment. Now, broadly, this can be classified as chemical or dry corrosion, or electrolytic or electrochemical or wet corrosion. Amongst these two types, that is chemical corrosion and electrolytic corrosion, what is more important clinically is the second type, that is electrolytic or the wet corrosion. But we will be discussing some points about chemical or dry corrosion because they do occur in some of the restorations. Okay, talking about chemical or dry corrosion, as the name suggests, that metal reacts to form oxides or sulfides in the absence of electrolytes. Okay, there are no electrolytes present, that is no electrolytic cell is present in case of dry corrosion, which is present in the case of wet corrosion. So what are the processes involved in formation of these oxides or sulfides in cases of dry corrosion? There are three processes involved. Just remember the names, that is oxidation, halogenation and sulfurization. So in chemical corrosion, there is basically a combination of the metallic and non-metallic elements by these processes which are mentioned over here. Now, to exemplify, we can say that because of dry corrosion, there is discoloration of silver by sulfur. Silver may be present in various cast metals as well as it is present in amalgam. So in cast metals, usually because of reaction of the silver present in the alloy with the sulfur. Now, sulfur is a common component of eggs which are consumed. So there is a formation of silver sulfide which could be responsible for corrosion, and this silver sulfide is formed as a result of dry corrosion and not because of wet corrosion. So dry corrosion can occur because of formation of silver sulfide in the alloys containing silver. So proceeding to the next type, which is more important. As a general rule, the metals with more positive potential have a lower tendency to dissolve in aqueous environments. Now, for example, we can see, now please visualize that there are two restorations in oral cavity. Okay, in the maxillary first molar, there is a cast gold restoration, and in the antagonist mandibular first molar, there is a amalgam restoration. Now, as you all know, what are the components of amalgam? That is, it mainly contains silver, tin, copper, whereas gold, as you can see in this table over here, it has a higher electrode potential. So in this case, if gold, while mastication, if gold and amalgam come into contact, this is the gold which has the higher electrode potential. The metal with the higher electrode potential will become the cathode, whereas that with the lower electrode potential, that is in this case the example which we are speaking about, the amalgam, will become a anode, and it is the amalgam that will corrode. Okay, so please remember, the metal with the lower electrode potential becomes an anode, and it is the anode which undergoes corrosion. Now, this concept is very important for you to know in this particular topic. I hope you understand this point. Now, from this table, what I need to tell you, give you one more information, is that the first three elements which I have mentioned in this particular table, that is gold, platinum and palladium, they are considered to be noble metals. Now, please note that in general terms, in layman terms, silver is also considered to be noble metal. When it comes to dental standards, silver is not considered to be a noble metal because, as you know, it can react with the air, water or other electrolytes in the oral cavity, and it can undergo corrosion. So from dental standards, silver is not considered to be a noble metal. This can be also asked as an MCQ. Now, next is cathode and electrolyte. As we just stated, that the one with the higher electrode potential becomes the cathode in the example which we just discussed about amalgam and cast gold restoration coming in contact. The gold which has higher electrode potential become cathode. It will not undergo corrosion, but in this case the silver amalgam will undergo corrosion because it has lower electrode, its components have lower electrode potential compared to that of gold. So cathode is the place where reduction reaction occurs, whereas anode is the area where oxidation reaction occurs. Now you must be knowing what electrolyte is. The electrolyte actually supplies the ions needed at the cathode and it carries away the corrosion products at the anode. Basically, electrolyte forms or completes the circuit that is required for this particular anti-electrolytic process to occur. Now proceeding with the further topics which are very important. So I hope you are clear with the concept of what forms anode and cathode, because they will be applied in various MCQs, various conceptual questions will be asked on this particular topic. That's why this has been included in our discussion. Now, what are the types of electrolytic corrosion, or what are types of wet corrosion which commonly occur in the dental restoration? So as you can see over here, the names are galvanic corrosion, stress corrosion and concentration cell corrosion. I will be discussing each in brief. Now starting with galvanic corrosion. Okay. Okay, starting with galvanic corrosion. So what are the causes of galvanic corrosion? Now galvanic corrosion, in broadly it can be divided into two main causes, that is dissimilar metals and heterogeneous surface composition. Now these are the causes. We'll see what are this particular diagram we'll see. Now figure to the left. Okay, you can see the labeling. There are the two different restorations. Now as we can repeat the same example. Just imagine that the restoration in the maxillary tooth in this particular diagram is a cast 4 restoration, whereas that in the lower tooth, that is a mandibular tooth, is an amalgam restoration. Now these two being dissimilar restorations, if they come in contact, okay, the electrolytic cell is completed. Okay, the circuit is completed and saliva acts as an electrolyte. When they are in direct contact, the patient may experience a galvanic shock. This is one of the reasons why bases are placed underneath the restoration, but usually it is the dissimilar metals are usually avoided in the oral cavity. So as you can see in the figure over here, the restorations are not in contact. Even if they are not in contact, or even if they are these two dissimilar restorations are not an antagonist tooth, even if they are in dissimilar regions and different regions. For example, one restoration is in the maxillary left quadrant and another is in the mandibular right quadrant. Within the same restoration, anode and cathode is created. In this case, the negative sign does not indicate cathode. Okay, in this case, the negative sign that is in the figure over here, it indicates that in that particular area there is lower electrode potential, whereas the positive area has a higher electrode potential. And as you all know, the one with the lower electrode potential corrodes. So in this case, at the base there will be corrosion. Now another cause for the corrosion is heterogeneous surface composition. Now this usually occurs in multiple phase alloys. As you all know, alloys are commonly used for dental restoration, and the alloys, various components are used. So within the same alloy itself, in a restoration, the component with the lower electrode potential may act as lower will act as an anode, and one with a higher may act as a cathode. For example, if you remember the table depicting the electrode potential, gold was placed at the topmost. So in high noble alloys, or in some of the alloys of gold and some other alloys used, for example silver is used. So within the same alloy, silver may act as anode because it has a lower electrode potential and it may corrode. So in heterogeneous surface composition is present, it will also lead to galvanic corrosion. So it usually occurs in multiple phase alloys. Now next form of corrosion is the stress corrosion. Okay, now in stress corrosion, what you need to know is what is stress corrosion. As the name itself suggests, it occurs in the regions of stress. That is, for example, the most common area The area for stress corrosion could be in case of removable partial denture, the clamp, the clasp, they are adjusted, they are usually under stress. So in those areas they can undergo stress corrosion. Please remember, in case of stress corrosion, the deformed metal areas act as anode. Okay, the deformed metal areas act as anode, as the less deformed regions act as cathode. And as we just said, that it is the anode which undergoes corrosion. Now, what are the clinical situations wherein stress corrosion can be seen? In the rise of restoration, because of notches or pits can act as sites of stress concentration. And since there is the stress concentration in that particular area, there is displacement of the atoms in that particular area, and because of which there is anode and cathode formation, and the anode undergoes corrosion. So even in the case of restoration, if they are not properly polished, or if they are very gross surface irregularities, they can act as areas of stress concentration. It is the notches and pits in the restoration can act as areas of stress concentration. Now this is also proposed as one of the mechanism of failure of rubber dam clamps. Now we just discussed the rubber dam clamps at the start of the lecture. And rubber dam clamps, as you know, there are two jaws which are connected by a bow. It is in the region of the bow that there is some flexion which occurs during the placement and the removal of the clamp, okay, while manipulating the rubber dam clamp. In the oral cavity, because of the clamp is in contact with the oral tissues, there is a possibility that it might undergo stress corrosion. So with prolonged use, even rubber dam clamps are susceptible to stress corrosion. Now one question regarding stress corrosion which has been asked in one of the competitive exams is that why is excessive burn debris, which is present in the interproximal area. Now next clinical situation regarding concentration cell corrosion is that the difference in the oxygen concentration between the parts of the stem restoration. Here we are talking about the pits in the restoration. As you can see over here, there is a microscopic pit. Okay, this pit may not be visible clinically, but at microscopic level it is very difficult to achieve completely polished surface. There may be a pit. Now usually this pit during function in the mouth, they may get covered by food debris. Okay, the orifice or the opening of this pit may be blocked, because of which the oxygen concentration at the base of the pit reduces. Okay, now bottom of the pit has lower oxygen concentration, so it is covered. The bottom of the pit will act as an anode, and the alloy surface around the pit will act as a cathode. And as we discussed, anode acts as anode is the region where the corrosion takes place. There will be corrosion occurring at the bottom of the pit, thereby deepening the pit and deteriorating the restoration further. So this is the reason why dental restorative materials should be polished. So this is one of the reasons. Now if you remember, just note one thing, in any clinical situation it is not just one type of corrosion taking place. Usually 2 or 3 types of corrosion occur simultaneously. It is very uncommon that only one type of corrosion will occur. For example, in this case, pits are also responsible for stress concentration, and they can also be factors responsible for stress corrosion. And pits are also, most commonly, pits in the restorations or microscopic irregularities in the restorations are responsible for concentration cell corrosion. And this is one of the reasons why the metallic restorations should be properly polished to avoid the concentration cell corrosion. Going to the third clinical situation responsible for concentration cell corrosion. Now this is called as the crevice corrosion. Now crevice corrosion is actually one of the subcategory of concentration cell corrosion. It cannot be categorized as a simple different type of corrosion. The causes for crevice corrosion are similar to that described for the previous 2 subtypes. That is, there could be a difference in the electrolytic concentration because of food debris. Also there could be a changes in the oxygen concentration responsible for changes in the electrode potential in that particular area. That is, what are various steps that can be taken to prevent protection against corrosion. Okay, first is maintaining oral hygiene, as we just discussed. Accumulation of food debris or the films which are formed are responsible for tarnish, and tarnish is a precursor for corrosion. So if the proper oral hygiene is maintained, there won't be formation of hard and soft deposits, or we can kind of inhibit, or we can reduce the formation of hard and soft deposits on the tooth on the restoration, thereby reducing the chance of corrosion. So maintaining oral hygiene is one of the ways of protection against corrosion. Next is passivation. What is passivation? Now certain metals form an oxide film on the surface of certain metals. When they are added to alloys, they form an oxide film on the surface of the restoration, and this oxide film protects from corrosion. Now one MCQ that can be asked in relation to passivation is that which are the metals that have a passivating effect, or which are the passivating metals. So please note that chromium, titanium and aluminium are considered to be passivating metals. It is not gold. Gold is not a passivating material. It is chromium, titanium and aluminium that is considered to be passivating materials. Now what passivating metals? Now what do these passivating metals do? They form an oxide film on the surface of the restoration, and thereby they prevent corrosion. Next is by increasing noble metal content, as we just discussed on the table about the electromotive series. Gold, palladium, platinum are noble metals. They have high electrode potential. And since they have high electrode potential, they do not usually undergo corrosion. Okay, so by increasing the noble metal content of an alloy, corrosion can be reduced to a great extent. Next is polishing restoration, which we just discussed, to prevent concentration cell corrosion. And next is avoiding dissimilar metal restoration, which we discussed to prevent the galvanic corrosion, the first type of corrosion in this particular topic. Okay, so with this we conclude today's lecture. If you have any doubts, please feel free to ask regarding these topics which we have discussed today. I hope you have understood about the corrosion aspect, which is actually a kind of few conceptual questions are asked on this particular topic. The first two were kind of facts and figures, that is regarding amalgam and cast restoration, cavity preparation for cast restoration. This particular topic has many concepts, that's why this has been included in this discussion, and this topic has been asked in quite a few entrance examinations. Okay, so with this we conclude today's lecture. If you have any doubts, please feel free to ask. Okay, now one doubt has been asked that high copper amalgam has no crevice corrosion, High copper amalgam also has some amount of corrosion, because you need to know that the eta phase in the high copper amalgam is also susceptible to corrosion, and it is actually this corrosion that is responsible for the sealing of that crevices. That is the region between the restoration and the tooth structure. However, you need to know one point from MCQ point of view is that the corrosion in high copper amalgam is not the type of penetrating